Victorian England, 1874. Lady Charlotte Sinclair stood at the window of her father's crumbling estate, watching the Duke of Greymont's carriage disappear into the rain. They had married only hours ago. He had promised her safety, security, a new beginning. Instead, his final words before leaving echoed in her mind like a curse. "You will go to Ashford Hall alone. Do not write to me. Do not seek me out. This marriage was a mistake." 3 months later, she would hear rumors of a duke traveling the countryside, appearing at taverns and coaching inns, asking strangers if they'd seen his wife, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I must find her. I must beg her forgiveness. But let us begin at the beginning, 3 weeks before that terrible wedding day." Charlotte's world had collapsed in the span of a single afternoon. Her father, the kindest man she had ever known, had fallen from his horse during a morning ride. By evening he was gone, and with him went everything Charlotte had believed about her life. The debts came to light within days. Her father had been protecting her from the truth. Rosewood Estate was drowning in debt, mortgaged to the hilt, barely holding together. And then Uncle Edmund arrived. Edmund Sinclair was her father's younger brother, a thin man with calculating eyes and a smile that never reached them. He stood in the drawing-room of Rosewood, looking at Charlotte as though she were livestock at market. "You understand your position now, I presume?" He said it so casually, as if her entire world hadn't just shattered. Charlotte lifted her chin, drawing on every lesson in dignity her mother had taught her before passing years ago. "I understand my father has passed, Uncle. I hardly think discussing my position is appropriate at this moment." Edmund's smile widened, and it was not kind. "Sentiment is a luxury you cannot afford, Charlotte. Your father's debts have left Rosewood practically insolvent. As your guardian, I have arranged a suitable match for you." "A match?" The words felt like ice spreading through her veins. She was only 21 years old. She had imagined marrying someday, yes, but for affection, for respect, for something real. "Lord Barnaby has expressed interest," Edmund continued, examining his fingernails as though bored. "He's willing to overlook the financial situation in exchange for a young wife." Charlotte went pale. Everyone in society knew Lord Barnaby. He was nearly 60 years old, with a reputation that made even the bravest women uncomfortable. 3 wives already dead, each one younger than the last. The whispers suggested cruelty, though nothing was ever proven. Men like Lord Barnaby existed above suspicion in their world. "I will not marry Lord Barnaby," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. Her uncle's hand came down hard on the mahogany desk, making her flinch. "You have no choice in the matter, girl. The banns will be read next Sunday, 1 week." Charlotte had 1 week before her fate was sealed. That night she sat in her room, staring at nothing, feeling the walls close in. Her lady's maid, Lily, found her there hours later. Lily had been with the family since Charlotte was a child. She knew Charlotte's heart better than anyone. "There's talk, miss," Lily whispered, glancing at the door to make sure they were alone. "The Duke of Greymont is seeking a wife." "A practical arrangement, they say." Charlotte frowned. Alexander Hartley, Duke of Greymont. She had heard the name, of course. Everyone had. He was wealthy beyond measure, powerful, with an ancestral seat in Devon and a London townhouse that was the envy of society. But he had disappeared from public life years ago after some tragedy. His young wife had died, people said. Since then he'd become a ghost, rarely seen at balls or social events. "What does that matter to me?" Charlotte asked, though something in her chest tightened with desperate hope. "He's powerful enough to stand against your uncle, miss," Lily said carefully. "And they say he wants no love, no expectations. Just a proper duchess to manage his household while he attends to his business affairs. A marriage in name only, a marriage in name only. No love, no intimacy, no real connection. Just safety, just survival." It wasn't what Charlotte had dreamed of, but dreams were luxuries, just as Uncle Edmund had said. 2 days later, through a careful network of servants and sympathetic friends, Charlotte arranged a meeting. The Duke of Greymont agreed to see her at a small gathering in London. When Charlotte first laid eyes on Alexander Hartley, her breath caught. He was not what she expected. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, in a way that suggested he cared little for fashion. His eyes were the deep blue of the sea before a storm. But they were empty, completely, utterly empty, as though all the life had been drained from them years ago. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, curtsying. He studied her for a long moment, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition, though they had never met. "Lady Charlotte," he said, his voice deep and cool like water running over stone, "I understand you have a proposal for me." She had rehearsed this moment 100 times. "I need protection from a forced marriage. You need a duchess. I can manage a household, represent your family at social functions, and ask nothing personal of you in return. All I require is your name and your protection from my uncle's schemes." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You're remarkably direct. I find honesty saves time, Your Grace, and I have very little time." Something in her voice must have conveyed her desperation, because Alexander's expression softened just for a moment. "Very well," he said. "I accept your terms. We'll marry by special license within the week." The wedding happened so quickly that Charlotte barely had time to process it. One moment she was trapped by Uncle Edmund's plans. The next she was standing in St. George's Church in Hanover Square, wearing a simple blue dress, speaking vows to a man she didn't know. Alexander barely looked at her during the ceremony. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid, as though every word of the marriage vows caused him physical pain. But when the vicar said, "You may kiss the bride," something changed. Alexander turned to her, and for just a moment his empty eyes flickered with something. Life, perhaps, or fear. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It was meant to be brief, perfunctory, for the sake of propriety and the handful of witnesses present. But the moment their lips touched, Charlotte felt it. A spark, electric and undeniable, that shot through her entire body. Her heart stuttered. Her breath caught, and when she opened her eyes, she saw that Alexander felt it too. His eyes had gone wide, almost panicked. He pulled back abruptly, his face draining of color. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. There was no reception, no celebration, just a brief signing of documents, and then they were outside in the cold London air. Uncle Edmund stood across the street, watching with a face mottled with rage. He had arrived too late to stop the wedding. Charlotte felt a fierce satisfaction at the sight of his fury. Alexander's hand tightened on her elbow, guiding her toward a waiting carriage. "He cannot touch you now," he said quietly. "You are a Hartley and under my protection." "Thank you, Your Grace," Charlotte whispered. "In private, call me Alexander." She tested the name on her tongue. Alexander. But as the carriage began to move, Charlotte noticed something wrong. They weren't heading toward Alexander's London townhouse. They were heading away from the city entirely. "Where are we going?" she asked. Alexander wouldn't meet her eyes. He was staring out the window, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. "Your Grace? Alexander?" Finally he turned to her, and the look on his face made her blood run cold. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse. It was anguish. The carriage stopped. They were at a crossroads outside London. Another carriage was waiting there. "This marriage was a mistake," Alexander said, his voice rough and broken. "I see that now. I thought I could do this. I thought it would be simple. But I was wrong." Charlotte's heart began to pound. "What are you saying?" "You will go to Ashford Hall in Derbyshire," he continued, not looking at her. "It's a comfortable estate, well staffed. You'll want for nothing." "But Alexander, we just married." "We agreed to, I know what we agreed to," he interrupted, finally meeting her eyes. "And I'm breaking that agreement. I cannot do this, Charlotte. I cannot see you. I cannot be near you." "But why? What did I do?" His face twisted with something that looked like pain. "You did nothing wrong. That's the problem. You remind me of—" He stopped himself. Just go, please, don't write to me. Don't seek me out. I'll ensure you're provided for financially, but I cannot see you again. Tears burned in Charlotte's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. Not when he was casting her aside like garbage on their wedding day. The footman opened the other carriage door. Charlotte stood on shaking legs. "Alexander," she said one last time, her voice barely above a whisper, "what did I do wrong?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw it clearly in his eyes. Not hatred, not disgust, but terror. Raw, absolute terror. "You did nothing wrong," he repeated. "That's what makes this unbearable." And then he was gone. The carriage door closed. Charlotte watched through the rain-streaked window as Alexander's carriage disappeared back toward London, taking with it every hope she had dared to let herself feel during that brief, electric kiss. She was alone, banished on her wedding day by a husband who looked at her with fear in his eyes. The journey to Ashford Hall took hours. Charlotte sat in silence, her mind spinning, trying to understand what had happened. What had she done? What had she said? Why had that kiss, that moment of genuine connection, caused Alexander to panic so completely? When the carriage finally pulled up to Ashford Hall, it was nearly midnight. The estate was beautiful, even in the darkness, a sprawling manor house with warm lights glowing in the windows. A housekeeper waited at the entrance, curtsying deeply. "Welcome, Your Grace. Your rooms have been prepared." Charlotte walked inside on numb legs. The house was lovely, comfortable, everything Alexander had promised. Everything except him. Everything except a husband. Everything except answers. That night, alone in a grand bedroom in a strange house, Charlotte finally let herself cry. But by morning the tears had dried, and in their place was something harder, something stronger. If Alexander didn't want her, fine. She would build a life without him. She would make something of herself here, in this place he had banished her to. She would not be destroyed by a man she barely knew. But she couldn't shake the memory of that look in his eyes. Not hatred, but terror, as though seeing her, kissing her, feeling something for her was the most frightening thing in the world. What manner of man had she married? And what ghost was she competing with? The journey to Ashford Hall took 3 days. 3 days of Charlotte sitting alone in that velvet-lined prison, watching the countryside roll past through rain-streaked windows. 3 days to replay every moment of her wedding day, searching for what she'd done wrong. She found nothing. Only the memory of Alexander's eyes, those storm-grey eyes that had looked at her during their kiss with something like wonder, then terror, then nothing at all. The carriage finally turned through iron gates, and Charlotte's breath caught despite her misery. Ashford Hall rose from the Derbyshire hills like something from a painting, golden stone glowing in the late afternoon sun, ivy climbing gracefully up the western wing, gardens that seemed to stretch forever. It was beautiful, achingly impossibly beautiful, and completely silent. The staff lined up as protocol demanded. Charlotte counted 15 people, housemaids, footmen, a stern-faced butler named Mr. Pemberton, and at the centre a woman whose kind eyes contradicted her rigid posture. "Your Grace," the woman curtsied deeply. "I'm Mrs. Beatrice Ashworth, the housekeeper. Welcome to Ashford Hall." Charlotte wanted to laugh. Welcome, as if she were a guest, not an exile. "Thank you, Mrs. Beatrice." Charlotte's voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm glad to be here." The lie tasted bitter. That first night, Charlotte wandered the halls like a ghost herself. The house was exquisite, every room a masterpiece of taste and wealth. Her chambers were larger than her entire childhood home, decorated in soft blues and creams, with a 4-poster bed that could fit 5 people. A fire crackled in the hearth. Fresh flowers stood in crystal vases. Everything perfect. Everything cold. She found Alexander's wedding gift on her dressing table, a sapphire necklace worth a small fortune. No note, just jewels, as if diamonds could replace explanations. Charlotte left it in its velvet box and climbed into that enormous bed alone, still wearing her travelling dress. She didn't cry. She'd done enough crying in the carriage. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and made a decision. If Alexander didn't want her, she would build a life without him. The first weeks passed in a strange routine. Mrs. Beatrice appeared every morning with breakfast on a silver tray. Charlotte explored the grounds, discovered a library with thousands of books, a music room with a pianoforte that sang when she touched it, gardens that could have swallowed her uncle's entire estate. She asked questions. Carefully at first. How long since the Duke last visited Ashford Hall? Mrs. Beatrice's hand stilled on the tea service. 5 years, Your Grace, not since— She caught herself. Not since before. Before what? Before he became as he is now. Charlotte learned to recognize that look, the way servants' eyes would slide away when she pressed too hard. They knew something they'd been instructed not to share. She found the portrait on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, hidden in a gallery she'd somehow missed. The painting was covered with a dust cloth, pushed into a corner as if someone had tried to forget it existed. Charlotte pulled the cloth away and gasped. The man in the portrait was Alexander, but not the Alexander she'd married. This Alexander was younger, perhaps 25, his face unlined by whatever darkness now haunted him. He was laughing, truly laughing, his head thrown back with pure joy. His eyes sparkled with life, with warmth, with everything the real Alexander seemed to have lost. He was different then. Charlotte spun. Mrs. Beatrice stood in the doorway, her expression conflicted, duty warring with compassion. "When was this painted?" Charlotte asked quietly. 7 years ago, Your Grace, before Lady Rosalind— Mrs. Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth, horror dawning. "Forgive me. I shouldn't have— Lady Rosalind." Charlotte's heart began to pound. "Who is Lady Rosalind?" But Mrs. Beatrice was already retreating, shaking her head. "I've said too much. Please, Your Grace, don't ask me more. It's not my place." She disappeared before Charlotte could press further. That night Charlotte couldn't sleep. Lady Rosalind. The name echoed through her mind like a ghost's whisper. Who was she? Why would mentioning her name make a seasoned housekeeper pale? And why had no one told Charlotte about her? The next morning Charlotte made a decision. If the servants wouldn't talk, perhaps the village would. She walked to the nearby town of Ashford, a picturesque collection of stone cottages and shops clustered around a village green. The locals stared as she passed. Word had clearly spread that the new Duchess of Greymont had arrived alone to an empty estate. Charlotte could read the pity in their eyes, the whispered speculation. Let them stare. She needed answers. The tavern, the King's Head, sat at the edge of the village square. Charlotte had never entered a tavern in her life. Proper young ladies didn't. But then again, proper young ladies didn't get banished on their wedding night either. The room fell silent when she entered. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her, widening in recognition. Charlotte approached the bar, where an elderly man stood polishing glasses. His weathered face held decades of village secrets. "I'm Charlotte Hartley," she said clearly, "the Duke of Greymont's wife. I'd like to ask you some questions about this estate's history." The old man studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded toward a corner table. "Sit, Your Grace, I'll bring tea." When he returned, he set the cup before her with careful deliberation. "Name's Thomas Webb. Been keeping this tavern 40 years. Mr. Webb, I need to know about Lady Rosalind." His hand trembled slightly. "You don't know?" "I know nothing. My husband sent me here without explanation." "His staff won't speak, please." Charlotte leaned forward, abandoning pride. "Please help me understand." Thomas Webb sighed deeply, the sound of a man carrying heavy memories. "Lady Rosalind Ashford. She was the Duke's first love, his fiancée 5 years back." The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow. Fiancée. What happened to her? "She died, Your Grace, the very morning of their wedding day." Thomas's eyes grew distant. "Carriage accident on the road to the church. Terrible thing. Wheel broke. Carriage went off the embankment. She was gone before they could reach her. Charlotte's teacup clattered against its saucer. On their wedding day. Aye, the Duke was already at the church, waiting. When word came, Thomas shook his head. Changed him completely. Wouldn't speak for weeks. Locked himself in Greymont Manor for near a year. When he finally emerged, he was like a different man. Cold. Distant. They say he blamed himself. Had insisted on that particular route despite the storm warnings. Charlotte's mind raced. Alexander had lost his fiancée on their wedding day. The trauma, the guilt, it explained so much about his behavior. The way he'd broken down after their ceremony. The terror in his eyes. But something still didn't make sense. "Mr. Webb," Charlotte said slowly, "what did Lady Rosalind look like?" The old man's expression shifted to something like sympathy. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small worn newspaper clipping, an engagement announcement from 5 years ago, complete with an illustration. He slid it across the table. Charlotte looked down at the drawing and the world tilted. The woman in the illustration could have been Charlotte's sister. Chestnut hair, delicate features, even the same shape of eyes, the same curve of mouth. "You look just like her," Thomas said quietly. "Near enough identical. That's why I hesitated when you walked in. For a moment I thought I was seeing a ghost." Charlotte's hands were shaking now. No wonder he couldn't bear it. "Pardon, Your Grace?" She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Thank you, Mr. Webb. You've been more help than you know." Charlotte walked back to Ashford Hall in a daze, the newspaper clipping clutched in her hand. Every piece fell into place now. Alexander hadn't rejected her because of anything she'd done. He'd rejected her because of what she represented. A ghost, a memory, a wound that had never healed. When he looked at Charlotte, he saw Rosalind. When he kissed Charlotte at their wedding, he'd felt something, perhaps even joy, and it had terrified him. Guilt over betraying Rosalind's memory. Fear of losing someone again. Maybe even superstitious dread that history would repeat itself. Charlotte reached her chambers and stood before the mirror, studying her reflection with new eyes. Same chestnut hair, same green eyes, same face that had smiled back at Rosalind from mirrors 5 years ago. The anger came first, white-hot and righteous. "I'm not a ghost," she said to her reflection. "I'm not some replacement for a dead woman. I'm Charlotte, and I'm alive, and I deserve to be seen as myself." But beneath the anger came hurt. Deep, aching hurt. Alexander had married her while seeing someone else. Their wedding kiss, that moment when she'd felt electricity, felt hope. He'd been thinking of another woman. Charlotte sank onto her bed, the newspaper clipping falling from her fingers. A knock interrupted her spiral. Mrs. Beatrice entered, her expression guilty. "Your Grace, I owe you an apology. I should have told you myself, not let you discover it from strangers." "You were following orders." Charlotte's voice was hollow. "Don't tell the new bride she's a replacement. Don't tell her she's living in a ghost's shadow." "You're not a replacement." Mrs. Beatrice sat beside her. A remarkable breach of protocol. "You're nothing like Lady Rosalind, truly. She was kind but fragile. Needed constant protection. You—" She smiled slightly. "You walked into a tavern alone seeking truth. You're stronger than she ever was. He doesn't see that. He only sees her face. Perhaps. But, Your Grace, strength can be learned. The Duke learned to be cold after heartbreak. Perhaps he can learn to be warm again." Charlotte shook her head. "I won't be haunted by a stranger's memory. I won't spend my life trying to be someone else, or trying to make him forget someone else. What will you do?" Charlotte stood, squaring her shoulders. "I'll build my own life. Here in Ashford. If my husband wants to hide from his past, that's his choice. But I refuse to be a ghost in my own marriage." Over the following weeks, Charlotte threw herself into action. She couldn't control Alexander's feelings, but she could control her own life. She discovered the village school was struggling. Too few teachers, too little funding. Charlotte began volunteering, teaching the girls to read and write. At first, the villagers were suspicious of the aristocratic duchess in their midst. But Charlotte's genuine warmth, her patience with the children, her refusal to stand on ceremony, these things won them over slowly. She befriended Emma Crawford, the vicar's sharp-minded sister, who'd stayed unmarried by choice and ran half the village's charitable work. Emma didn't pity Charlotte or tiptoe around her situation. "Your husband's a fool," Emma said bluntly over tea one afternoon. "Sending a wife like you away to rot in the country." "He's haunted," Charlotte replied. "I can't compete with a ghost." "Then don't compete, live." Emma grasped her hand. "Be so fully yourself that he realizes what he's lost." Charlotte took that advice to heart. She opened a small school on the estate grounds. Alexander's steward appeared monthly with financial reports and never once objected to her expenditures. If anything, the Duke seemed to be watching from afar, supporting her projects through his silence. But he never wrote, never visited, never sent word beyond the formal financial documents his steward delivered. Charlotte told herself she was relieved. She was building a life without him, a meaningful life, she taught. She laughed with the children. She grew strong and independent. But late at night, alone in that enormous bed, she sometimes touched her wedding ring and remembered that kiss. That single moment when she'd felt wanted, cherished, alive. And she hated herself for it. 3 months after arriving at Ashford Hall, an envelope arrived with the morning post. Charlotte recognized the heavy paper, the ducal seal. Alexander's correspondence, though not in his hand. Inside, pressed between 2 sheets of paper, was a single forget-me-not flower. No note, no explanation. Just the flower, dried and preserved with obvious care, forget-me-not. Charlotte stared at it for a long moment. Was this an apology, a plea? A reminder that he remembered her, even if he couldn't face her? Or was it meant for Rosalind? Perhaps Alexander sent these flowers to his dead love's grave every year, and one had accidentally been included with Charlotte's correspondence. The thought made her furious. She carried the envelope to the fireplace in her sitting room. Mrs. Beatrice found her there an hour later, the flower reduced to ash, Charlotte's face set like stone. "Your Grace, forget-me-not," Charlotte said flatly. "How fitting. He wants to be remembered while he forgets I exist. Perhaps he meant, I don't care what he meant." Charlotte turned from the fireplace, her eyes bright but tearless. "Let him send his cryptic flowers. Let him pay for my school and watch from afar through his steward's reports. I'm done waiting for Alexander Hartley to remember he has a wife." But that night, in her dreams, she heard his voice, broken and desperate, whispering 2 words, "Forgive me." Charlotte woke with tears on her cheeks and refused to examine why. The months that followed transformed Charlotte in ways she'd never imagined possible. By the end of her 4th month at Ashford Hall, she was no longer the frightened girl who'd arrived in that lonely carriage. She woke each morning with purpose, dressed simply, and walked to the village where 20 eager faces waited for her lessons. The school she'd opened, housed in a renovated barn on the estate grounds, had become the heart of her new life. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history to girls whose families had never dreamed of education. Emma Crawford became more than a friend. She became Charlotte's anchor in this strange new world. They took tea together every Wednesday, and Emma's sharp wit and uncompromising honesty kept Charlotte grounded. "You're blooming," Emma observed one afternoon, studying Charlotte over her teacup. "When you first arrived, you looked like a wilted flower. Now you're magnificent." Charlotte laughed, but she knew it was true. She'd stopped waiting for Alexander's approval, stopped measuring herself against a ghost's memory, stopped being the dependent girl who'd needed marriage to escape her uncle's control. She belonged to herself now, a revelation both terrifying and exhilarating. The villagers had fully embraced her. They called her our Duchess with genuine affection, sought her advice on matters both trivial and significant, and invited her to every festival and gathering. Charlotte attended them all, determined to build roots in this community that had welcomed her when her own husband would not. She even considered asking Alexander for an annulment. The thought came to her late one night as she reviewed her students' work by candlelight. They'd been married in name only, never consummated, never truly together. Surely the church would grant her freedom. She could remain here in Ashford, continue her teaching, live independently. The idea should have brought relief, but instead it made her chest ache in a way she refused to examine. Yet Alexander's shadow lingered, despite her determination to move forward. His steward, Mr. Thornton, continued his monthly visits like clockwork. The man never asked direct questions, but Charlotte knew he was reporting back, noting her activities, her expenditures, her integration into village life. The financial support Alexander provided was generous, almost absurdly so. When Charlotte requested funds for new schoolbooks, the amount that arrived could have bought an entire library. When she mentioned needing repairs to the barn, craftsmen appeared within days. "He can keep his money," Charlotte told Emma after one particularly lavish disbursement. "I don't need his pity. I need nothing from him at all." But the words tasted like lies even as she spoke them, because despite her anger, despite her growth and independence, Charlotte sometimes found herself touching her wedding ring without thinking. She'd catch herself remembering that kiss in the church, the electricity of it, the brief moment when Alexander's eyes had blazed with something like wonder before terror took over. She dreamed of him occasionally, always the same fragmented images, his hands trembling as he'd placed the ring on her finger, his voice breaking as he'd sent her away, his face in that old portrait radiating the joy he'd lost. In her waking hours, she pushed these thoughts down ruthlessly. She'd built protective walls around her heart, brick by careful brick, and she refused to let memories breach them. Emma noticed, of course. "You still care for him," she said gently one evening. Charlotte's immediate denial died on her lips. "I care for the man he might have been, the man in that portrait who could laugh. But that man is dead, Emma, as dead as Lady Rosalind. And if he's not, if he's simply buried under grief and fear, then that's his choice to unbury himself. I won't dig him out." The harvest festival arrived in October, and Charlotte threw herself into the preparations with determination. She would dance, laugh, celebrate, prove to herself and everyone watching that she was whole without Alexander Hartley. Emma warned her the night before, "The Duke's men are still watching. Mr. Thornton will report everything. Be careful, Charlotte." "Let them watch," Charlotte said firmly. "I have nothing to hide. Let Alexander see that I'm thriving without him. Maybe then he'll finally let me go completely." But that night, alone in her chambers after the festival, where she danced with the vicar's nephew and laughed at the children's performances, Charlotte dreamed again. This time Alexander's voice was clearer than ever before, desperate, broken, filled with anguish. Just 2 words repeated like a prayer: "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me." She woke with her heart pounding and tears on her face, and for the first time in months she whispered into the darkness, "I don't know if I can." London felt like a prison to Alexander Hartley, though he'd chosen these walls himself. For 3 months he'd barely left Greymont Manor, the ancestral townhouse that had witnessed his descent into self-imposed isolation. The servants whispered about him. He knew they did. The Duke who couldn't sleep, who paced the halls at night like a restless ghost, who drank far too much brandy and ate far too little. Society had noticed his absence too. Invitations piled up unanswered. The gossip columns speculated endlessly about the missing Duchess of Greymont. "Where is the new bride?" they asked in print. "Why does the Duke appear alone, haggard, at only the most unavoidable social functions?" Alexander couldn't tell them the truth, that he was a coward who destroyed the one good thing that had entered his life since Rosalind's death. The full weight of what he'd done to Charlotte crushed him more with each passing day. He saw her face every time he closed his eyes, heard her voice asking, "What did I do wrong?" The memory of their wedding kiss haunted him most of all, that brief blazing moment when he'd felt alive again, felt hope, felt something beyond the grey numbness that had consumed him for 5 years. It was that very hope that had terrified him into sending her away. Rosalind's death had nearly destroyed him completely. She'd been his first love, his childhood friend turned fiancée, and losing her on their wedding day had felt like divine punishment for his arrogance. He'd insisted on that route to the church despite the storm warnings, convinced his will could control even the weather. When the carriage went off the embankment and Rosalind died instantly, Alexander had known the truth. He destroyed everything he loved, and he would never risk that curse again. For 5 years he'd kept that vow, building walls of ice around his heart, refusing every social connection beyond surface politeness. Then his father's will had forced his hand, marry or lose everything. He'd chosen Charlotte precisely because she was convenient, because the marriage would be in name only, because he would never have to risk caring. But then he'd seen her at the altar, and something had shifted. Her quiet dignity, her nervousness she tried to hide, the way she'd looked at him with such tentative hope, it had cracked something in his frozen heart. And when he'd kissed her, when he'd felt that jolt of genuine feeling, the terror had crashed over him like a tidal wave. History would repeat. He would doom Charlotte just as he'd doomed Rosalind. The resemblance between them only made it worse. When he looked at Charlotte's face, he saw both women, past and present, colliding in a way that made him feel like he was going mad. So he'd done the only thing his broken mind could conceive. He'd sent her away to protect her from himself. 3 months later, he knew what a fool he'd been. Protection was just another word for cowardice, and he'd hurt Charlotte far more than any curse could have. Lord Marcus Blackwood, Alexander's closest friend since their school days, finally forced a confrontation. He arrived at Greymont Manor unannounced, pushed past the protesting butler, and found Alexander in his study nursing his 3rd brandy before noon. "This ends now," Marcus declared, yanking the glass from Alexander's hand. "You're killing yourself over a ghost and destroying an innocent woman in the process." Alexander laughed bitterly. "You don't understand. I had to send her away. I had to protect her. From what? From happiness? From having a husband who gives a damn?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. "I was in Derbyshire last week, Alexander. I saw her." Alexander's head snapped up, his heart suddenly hammering. "Charlotte? Your wife? The woman you abandoned?" Marcus's voice gentled slightly. "She's opened a school for village girls. She's teaching them to read, bringing light to that entire community. The locals adore her. And do you know what I heard them say? They called her brave, strong, resilient. She's thriving, Alexander, not because of you, but despite you." The words pierced Alexander like arrows. Charlotte was building a life without him, becoming the woman she was always meant to be, and he'd missed all of it, locked in his mansion of grief and guilt. "She doesn't need your protection," Marcus continued relentlessly. "She needed your honesty. She needed a partner, not a coward who pushed her away rather than risk feeling something real." Alexander stood abruptly, crossed to the window overlooking the rain-soaked London streets. "When I kissed her at our wedding, Marcus, I felt joy for the first time since Rosalind died. Pure, uncomplicated joy, and it terrified me. What right did I have to feel that? What right did I have to risk her life for my happiness? So you chose to risk her heart instead?" Marcus shook his head. "That's not nobility, old friend. That's just fear." The words hung in the air, undeniable. Alexander pressed his forehead against the cold glass, feeling something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut for 5 long years. That evening, Alexander did something he hadn't done since Rosalind's funeral. He visited her grave in the small chapel cemetery on his country estate. Rain fell softly as he knelt before the simple marble headstone, and for the first time he spoke to her honestly. "I loved you, Rosalind. I always will. But I'm still here. I'm still alive. And I've hurt someone innocent because I was too afraid to let you go, too afraid to believe I deserved a second chance." The words came easier now, Years of dammed-up guilt finally breaking free. I don't think you'd want this for me. This half-life, this prison I've built. You were always so full of life, so determined that I should be happy. I think you'd be disappointed in the man I've become." He stood, rain mixing with tears on his face. "I'm going to find her, Rosalind. I'm going to beg Charlotte's forgiveness. I'm going to fight for a future, even though I'm terrified. And wherever you are, I hope you understand." Alexander left the cemetery with new purpose burning in his chest. He returned to Greymont Manor, ordered his valet to pack, and prepared to leave for Ashford Hall at first light. But when he arrived 3 days later, Mrs. Beatrice met him at the door with devastating news. "Your Grace, the Duchess left a week ago. She didn't say where she was going, only that she needed time away. She left no forwarding address." Alexander stood in Charlotte's empty sitting room, seeing the evidence of the life she'd built. Books on education, children's drawings pinned to a board, a small vase with dried wildflowers. On her desk, he found the schoolroom she'd created, filled with primers and slates and evidence of her generous heart. He picked up one of the children's drawings, a crude but enthusiastic sketch labeled Duchess Charlotte, our teacher. The little girl had drawn Charlotte with a crown of flowers and a smile that radiated warmth. Alexander sank into Charlotte's chair, the drawing clutched in his hands, and truly understood what he'd destroyed. Not just a marriage, but a remarkable woman's trust. Not just a partnership, but a chance at real earned love. "I'll find her," he said aloud to the empty room, his voice raw with determination. "I'll search every corner of England if I must. I'll spend the rest of my life making amends. Charlotte Hartley, I swear to you, I will find you. And I will prove I can be the man you deserve." Alexander's search began the very next morning, and with it began his transformation from the cold Duke of Greymont into a man stripped bare by desperation and regret. He started in Yorkshire, riding through rain and fog to every coaching inn, every village, every place Charlotte might have passed through. At each stop, he showed a miniature portrait, described her chestnut hair, green eyes, a quiet dignity that commanded respect, and asked the same question in an increasingly hoarse voice: "Have you seen my wife?" The innkeepers studied him with curiosity and pity. This disheveled aristocrat bore little resemblance to the polished duke society knew. His clothes grew rumpled, his face unshaven, his eyes haunted with sleeplessness. "I, sir, a lady of that description stayed here 3 nights past," one innkeeper told him in a small Yorkshire village. "Kept to herself, paid in coin, left no word of where she was bound." Alexander left notes everywhere, stuffed into the hands of innkeepers and postal clerks, pinned to church doors. "Charlotte, please. I was a fool. I'm searching for you. Please let me explain." He moved south to Cornwall, following whispered rumors and half-remembered sightings. In a seaside village, a fisherman's wife recalled a duchess who'd walked the beaches at dawn, staring out at the grey Atlantic as if contemplating sailing away from England entirely. Alexander stood on that same beach, feeling the wind tear at his coat, imagining Charlotte here, alone, hurting, trying to find peace. "I can feel her presence," he told his exhausted valet. "I'm always one step behind." His appearance deteriorated further. The fastidious duke, who'd never appeared in public without perfect grooming, now rode through villages with mud-splattered boots and wind-tangled hair. He didn't care. Nothing mattered except finding Charlotte. By the 5th week, desperation had given way to something deeper. A bone-deep need not just to apologize, but to truly know the woman he'd married. At each stop he heard stories about her. In one village, she'd helped deliver a baby when the midwife was delayed. In another, she'd paid for a widow's roof repairs. In a third, children still sang a song she'd taught them. Alexander collected these stories like precious gems, building a picture of Charlotte that had nothing to do with Rosalind's ghost. She was generous where Rosalind had been sheltered. She was brave where Rosalind had been fragile. She was her own person entirely, and he'd been too blind with grief to see it. In Bath, he encountered Emma Crawford visiting her sister. Emma recognized him immediately, her expression hardening. "Why should she forgive you, Your Grace?" Emma demanded when he approached her in the pump room, causing a scandal by his very appearance. Dukes didn't confront unmarried women in public, and certainly not looking like vagabonds. Alexander didn't care about scandal anymore. "She shouldn't. I don't deserve it. But I need to try. I need to tell her the truth about Rosalind, about my cowardice, about everything." Emma studied him for a long moment, taking in his ravaged appearance, the genuine anguish in his eyes. "What's Charlotte's favorite flower?" The question caught him off guard. I don't know. Her favorite book? I don't know. Her mother's name? Her greatest fear? Her secret dream? Each "I don't know" fell from his lips like a stone. Emma's expression shifted from anger to something like pity. "You loved a ghost, Your Grace. Do you even know your wife?" The words gutted him. "No, but I want to. God help me. I want to know everything about her. I've spent 8 weeks learning who Charlotte truly is from strangers, and every story makes me realize what an extraordinary woman I cast aside. I don't deserve her forgiveness, Miss Crawford, but I'm begging for the chance to earn it." Something in his raw honesty must have moved Emma, because she leaned closer and whispered, "Lake District. Her mother was from there. It's the only place she ever spoke of with longing." Alexander grasped her hand with gratitude that shocked them both. "Thank you. Thank you." He was gone before she could respond, riding north with renewed purpose. The Lake District brought more false leads. A duchess spotted in Windermere, another in Grasmere, sightings that dissolved into nothing when he arrived. The newspapers had picked up his story by now. The searching Duke became a sensation, aristocracy and romance and public desperation all tangled together. Society was scandalized. Dukes didn't display emotion. They certainly didn't ride across England like madmen searching for wives they'd rejected. Alexander read one article over breakfast at a coaching inn. The Duke of Greymont appears at dawn in village squares, his voice breaking as he asks for his wife. Locals report he whispers "forgive me" in his sleep. Is this love or madness? Both, Alexander thought. It was both. By the 8th week he'd reached the Scottish borders, exhausted and nearly hopeless. He'd searched dozens of villages, left hundreds of notes, travelled over 1,000 miles. What if Charlotte had left England entirely? What if she never wanted to be found? He was sitting in yet another coaching inn, staring at his untouched dinner, when a young boy approached timidly. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I heard you asking about a lady. Chestnut hair, kind eyes?" Alexander's heart stopped. Yes, have you seen her?" "Aye, sir. A lady like that lives in a wee cottage by the loch, just north of here. Keeps to herself mostly, but she gave me 2pence when I helped carry her parcels last week. Said she liked the quiet." Alexander could barely breathe. "Take me there now, I'll pay you anything." An hour later, rain pouring from dark skies, Alexander stood outside a small stone cottage overlooking a misty loch. Through the window he could see her. Charlotte, sitting by the fire, reading a book, her face peaceful in the golden lamplight. She looked different somehow, stronger, more herself, absolutely beautiful. Alexander's courage nearly failed. What right did he have to disturb her peace? She'd built this life without him. She was happy, or at least healing. His hand raised to knock, then fell. Raised again. What could he possibly say that would make up for what he'd done? But then he remembered Emma's words. "Do you even know your wife?" And he realized he wanted to spend the rest of his life learning the answer to that question. He knocked. Charlotte had heard the rumors, of course. Even in her isolated cottage by the Scottish loch, news travelled. Lily, the girl from the nearby village who brought supplies twice weekly, had arrived 3 days ago with newspapers tucked under her arm and excitement in her eyes. "Your Grace, you must see this. The whole country's talking about it." Charlotte had unfolded the papers with trembling hands and read about Alexander's search. The searching Duke, they called him, riding across England like a man possessed. appearing at dawn in village squares asking for his wife, leaving desperate notes everywhere he went. The articles described his deterioration, his public displays of emotion, his whispered pleas of "forgive me" that coaching-in staff reported hearing through thin walls. Charlotte's first reaction had been anger, sharp and hot. How dare he make a spectacle of their private pain? How dare he search for her now, after months of silence turning their tragedy into society's entertainment? But beneath the anger stirred something more complicated. Curiosity, perhaps, or the remnants of feelings she'd tried so hard to bury. She'd made a decision then, sitting by her cottage fire with those newspapers spread across her lap. If Alexander found her, she would listen. She owed herself that much, the truth finally, without barriers or distance. But she wouldn't make it easy for him, and she certainly wouldn't forgive him simply because he'd made a dramatic gesture of searching. Forgiveness, if it came at all, would have to be earned through honesty and change, not theatrical displays of remorse. Now 3 days later, the knock came. Charlotte knew before she opened the door who would be standing there. She'd felt it somehow, a shift in the air, a sense of inevitability. She set down her book, smoothed her simple dress, and walked to the door with her heart hammering against her ribs. The rain was pouring when she opened it, and there stood Alexander, but not the Alexander she remembered. This man was haggard, his face unshaven, his expensive coat mud-splattered and rumpled. His hair was wet and disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion or tears or both. He looked nothing like the cold, controlled Duke who'd sent her away. He looked human, broken, real. They stared at each other for a long, charged moment. Charlotte could see him drinking in the sight of her, his expression a mixture of relief and anguish, and something that looked like reverence. "Charlotte," he breathed, and her name on his lips carried the weight of 8 weeks of searching. "What are you doing here?" Her voice came out colder than she felt. Alexander flinched. "I've been searching for weeks. I needed to find you. I needed to explain." "Explain what?" Charlotte crossed her arms, staying in the doorway, not inviting him inside. "How you destroyed me on our wedding night. How you sent me away like I was nothing. I know about your search, Alexander. I read the papers. Quite the spectacle you've made. I don't care about spectacles or society or anything except you." His voice cracked. "Please let me tell you everything. Let me explain about Rosalind, about why I know about Rosalind." Charlotte's words cut through his plea. "I know she was your fiancée. I know she died on your wedding day. I know I look like her." She watched the shock register on his face. "Yes, I discovered your secret months ago. You hurt me because I reminded you of someone else. You married me seeing a ghost." Alexander's face crumpled. "Charlotte, please. You don't get to please me." Her anger finally broke through, years of hurt and humiliation pouring out. "You had a wedding night to tell me the truth. You had our carriage ride to explain. Instead, you looked at me with horror and sent me into exile without a word of explanation. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I spent weeks thinking I was defective, broken, wrong somehow. You're not wrong. You've never been wrong. I was terrified, grieving, protecting me." Charlotte's voice dripped with sarcasm. "I've had months to imagine your excuses, Alexander. But here's what matters. You hurt me because you were too much of a coward to face your own feelings. You decided what was best for me without giving me any choice. You treated me like a problem to be managed, not a person with her own mind and heart." The rain poured harder, soaking Alexander where he stood, but he didn't seem to notice. "You're right. About all of it. I was a coward. I'm a coward. But Charlotte, please let me tell you everything. The complete truth about Rosalind, about the accident, about why seeing you terrified me so badly." Charlotte wanted to slam the door in his face. Part of her still wanted to punish him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain she'd endured. But another part, the part that had read those newspaper articles about his desperate search, that remembered the electricity of their wedding kiss, that had dreamed of his voice whispering, "Forgive me," that part needed to hear the truth, "Come inside," she finally said, stepping back. "You'll catch your death in that rain." Alexander's expression flooded with hope as he stepped across the threshold. Charlotte held up a hand immediately. "But don't mistake this for forgiveness, Alexander. You have a very long way to go. I'm letting you in because I deserve to hear the truth, and because I've spent too long living in the shadow of secrets. But whether I ever trust you again, whether I ever let you back into my life, that remains to be seen." She gestured to a chair by the fire, maintaining distance between them. "Now talk. Tell me everything." "And Alexander?" Her eyes met his, hard and unflinching. "If you lie to me even once, if you hide anything or soften any truth, I will ask you to leave and you will never see me again. Do you understand?" Alexander nodded, sinking into the chair like a man who'd been carrying impossible weight for far too long. "I understand. And Charlotte, thank you for listening, for giving me this chance. I don't deserve it." "No," Charlotte agreed quietly, settling into the chair across from him, the fire crackling between them like a barrier. "You don't, so make it count." Alexander talked for over an hour, and Charlotte listened without interruption. He told her everything, about Rosalind, about their childhood friendship that had bloomed into love, about the wedding day that had ended in tragedy. He described the storm warnings he'd ignored, his arrogant insistence on that particular route, the messenger arriving at the church with news that shattered his world. He confessed the guilt that had consumed him for 5 years, the vow he'd made never to love again, the walls of ice he'd built around his heart. Then he told her about their wedding day, how seeing her at the altar had cracked something open in him, how their kiss had made him feel alive for the first time since Rosalind's death, and how that very joy had terrified him into sending her away. "When I felt happiness with you, I thought I was betraying Rosalind's memory," Alexander said, his voice raw. "And I was terrified that if I let myself care for you, I'd doom you too. I thought I was protecting you from my curse, but I see now. I was protecting myself from the pain of loving and losing again." Charlotte sat very still, processing everything. The full truth was both better and worse than she'd imagined. Better because it wasn't about her inadequacy. Worse because he'd hurt her out of fear rather than malice, and fear was harder to hate. "You hurt me because I reminded you of someone else," she finally said, "but also because you felt something real for me, and that scared you more than anything." Alexander nodded miserably. "I know how that sounds. I know it's not a good enough reason. But Charlotte, these past 8 weeks of searching for you, learning about you from strangers, I fell in love with who you actually are. Not because you look like Rosalind, but because you're brave and kind and strong in ways she never was. You're not her shadow. You're not anyone's shadow. You're Charlotte, and you're extraordinary." The words should have moved her, but Charlotte's anger flared again. "And yet you needed to lose me completely before you could see that. You needed 8 weeks and 1,000 miles to realize what you should have known on our wedding day, that I'm a person, not a ghost." "You're right." "I'm so sorry. I'm so desperately sorry." Charlotte stood abruptly, needing distance. "Sorry isn't enough, Alexander. I've spent months building a life without you. I've grown from a dependent girl into someone who knows her own worth. I was starting to be happy. Why should I risk that for a man who might wake up one day and decide to send me away again?" Alexander rose too, but didn't approach. "I can't promise I won't be afraid, but I promise I'll never run again. I'll face my fears with you, not by abandoning you. Charlotte, give me a chance to prove I can be the partner you deserve." She studied him for a long moment, this broken man who looked nothing like the cold duke she'd married. "If I give you this chance, and I haven't decided yet, we do this on my terms. You stay at the village inn, not here. We start over. Not as Duke and Duchess, but as Alexander and Charlotte. No more secrets, no more protecting me by pushing me away. And I continue my teaching. I won't give up the life I've built." "I agree to everything," Alexander said immediately. "Whatever you need, whatever you want." I'll earn your trust one day at a time. And so began the strangest courtship of Charlotte's life. Alexander took a room at the village inn and appeared at her cottage each morning like a suitor calling on a lady. The first 3 days were stilted and awkward. They walked by the loch in careful silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Charlotte kept her walls firmly in place, watching for signs that Alexander might retreat back into his cold shell. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he asked questions about her childhood, her dreams, her experiences at Ashford Hall. He listened with genuine interest as she described opening the school, befriending Emma, discovering her own strength. "I never asked you about yourself," he admitted on the 4th day. "On our wedding day, I never asked what you wanted from life, what made you happy, what you feared. I treated you like a solution to my father's will, not a person." "Yes, you did," Charlotte agreed, still unable to soften completely. But something began to shift on the 5th day. Alexander arrived at the cottage to find Charlotte surrounded by books and papers, preparing lessons for when she returned to Ashford. Without being asked, he sat down and began helping, organizing primers, creating simple reading exercises, offering suggestions from his own education. Charlotte watched him work, seeing a gentleness she'd never witnessed before. He was patient, thoughtful, genuinely invested in helping the children he'd never met. That afternoon they walked to the village together, and Charlotte introduced him to the local children. Alexander knelt in the mud to speak with a shy little girl, making her laugh with a silly face. He helped an old woman carry her market basket without being asked. He was, Charlotte realized with some surprise, trying to be the kind of man she could respect. By the 8th day they were talking more easily. Alexander shared stories about his childhood, about the man he'd been before grief hardened him. Charlotte found herself laughing at his self-deprecating humor, warming to this version of him that felt authentic rather than performed. "Your favorite flower?" Alexander said suddenly during one of their walks. "It's daisies, isn't it?" Charlotte stopped, surprised. "How did you know?" "Because they're everywhere in your cottage. And Emma mentioned once that you preferred simple things to elaborate ones. Daisies are simple, resilient, and underestimated, just like you." Tears pricked Charlotte's eyes at the observation. He was paying attention, really paying attention. On the 12th day, Charlotte finally shared the depth of her pain from the banishment. "I felt like I didn't exist," she told him as they sat by the loch watching the sunset. "Like I was just a ghost you couldn't face. Not real enough to matter." Alexander's own tears fell freely. "You matter more than anything. I see that now. I'm so sorry I made you feel invisible. You're the most real, most vital person I've ever known." Something cracked in Charlotte's carefully constructed walls. This vulnerability, this honesty, it was what she'd needed from the beginning. By the 14th day, Charlotte made her decision. "I'm ready to try, Alexander, to build something real together." "Are you certain?" he asked, hardly daring to hope. "Not because I searched for you, but because you've changed. You've learned who I actually am. You see me now, not as Rosalind's echo, not as a convenient solution, but as Charlotte. That's all I ever wanted." Alexander reached for her hand slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, he brought it to his lips. "I'll spend my life seeing you, knowing you, choosing you every single day." Their kiss, when it finally came, was nothing like the wedding kiss. This one was built on truth, on choice, on earned trust. It was tender and promising and real. They made plans to return to London together, to face society as true partners. Charlotte's school would continue. Alexander would fund its expansion with genuine enthusiasm. They would face his world together, as equals. "But first," Charlotte said, "there's something we must do together." "What?" "Say goodbye to Rosalind, properly, together." Alexander's eyes widened with understanding and gratitude. "You would do that?" "She was part of your life. I can't erase that, and I don't want to. But we need to close that chapter before we can fully open ours." Hand in hand they began to plan their future, one built not on secrets and fear, but on honesty, growth, and the courage to love again. Their return to London caused exactly the scandal Charlotte had expected, but she faced it with a dignity that silenced even the cruelest gossips. At their first society event, a ball hosted by the Duchess of Pembroke, Charlotte stood beside Alexander and addressed the whispering crowd with clear, unwavering composure. "My husband made a mistake," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. "He was haunted by grief and made choices born of fear rather than malice. He spent 8 weeks searching for me, crossing England on his knees essentially, proving that even dukes can be humbled by love. I have chosen to give him that chance because forgiveness, real earned forgiveness, is more powerful than pride. I hope you'll respect that choice." The room remained silent for a heartbeat. Then Lady Pembroke began to clap, slowly at first, then with genuine enthusiasm, and others joined until applause filled the space. It wasn't universal approval. Some matrons still sniffed disapprovingly. Some gentlemen made crude jokes, but Charlotte had claimed her narrative, and that mattered more than unanimous acceptance. Within a month, they became society's favorite love story, the tale of the searching duke and the wife who gave him a second chance, spreading like wildfire through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs across England. But Charlotte cared little for society's approval now. She had more important matters to attend to. The visit to Rosalind's grave came on a crisp autumn morning, and Charlotte insisted they go together as she'd promised. Alexander was visibly nervous as their carriage approached the small chapel cemetery on his country estate, his hands trembling slightly as he helped Charlotte down. They walked hand in hand to the simple marble headstone that read, "Lady Rosalind Ashford, beloved daughter 1850-1869, gone too soon." Charlotte knelt beside Alexander, and to his surprise, she laid a bouquet of white roses on the grave herself. "Thank you for loving him first," Charlotte said softly, speaking to the woman who had shaped so much of their story. "Thank you for teaching him that love is worth the risk, even though your ending was tragic. I promise to honor your memory by building a life with him that's full of the joy you would have wanted for him." Alexander's tears fell freely. Years of guilt and grief finally released in healing sobs. Charlotte held him as he wept. This proud duke who'd learned to be vulnerable, who'd learned that strength sometimes meant breaking open rather than staying frozen. "I'll always remember you, Rosalind," Alexander said through his tears. "But my future is with Charlotte now. I hope wherever you are you understand. I hope you're at peace." They sat together by the grave for nearly an hour, Alexander sharing stories about Rosalind that he'd never told anyone, happy memories that he'd locked away with the pain. Charlotte listened, understanding that Rosalind would always be part of Alexander's history, but that history didn't have to haunt their future. As they walked away hand in hand, the sun broke through the clouds in that perfect, almost theatrical way that nature sometimes offers, and Alexander laughed, a genuine, joyful sound that Charlotte had heard so rarely. "What is it?" she asked. "I'm free," he said simply. "For the first time in 5 years I feel free." They moved into Greymont Manor together, not Ashford Hall, which held too many memories of Charlotte's lonely months. Alexander gave her free rein to transform the ancestral home, and Charlotte brought light and warmth to rooms that had been shrouded in darkness for years. She opened curtains, filled vases with flowers, invited people for dinners and musicales. Most importantly, she established a school for girls on the estate grounds, fulfilling her passion for education with Alexander's complete support. He attended the opening ceremony and gave a speech that moved many to tears about how his wife had taught him that second chances were possible, that growth was never too late, that love could be learned and earned rather than simply stumbled into. Rosalind's portrait, after much discussion, was moved to Alexander's private study with Charlotte's blessing. "She was part of your life," Charlotte said firmly when Alexander suggested storing it away. I won't erase that. But she's your past, Alexander, and I'm your present and future. I'm secure enough in that to share space with her memory. That generosity of spirit was typical of the woman Charlotte had become, and Alexander fell more deeply in love with her every day as he discovered new facets of her character, her strength, yes, but also her compassion, her wit, her practical wisdom that balanced his tendency toward brooding. 6 months after their reconciliation, Charlotte woke one morning with a familiar queasiness and knew immediately what it meant. She waited until that evening, when they were alone in their sitting room, Alexander reading aloud from a novel while she pretended to embroider. "Alexander," she interrupted gently, "I have something to tell you." He looked up, immediately attentive. "What is it?" "I'm with child." Charlotte watched carefully for his reaction, knowing this would be a test. Would fear overtake him again? Would memories of Rosalind's death on what should have been a joyful occasion poison this moment? Alexander's face went pale, and for a terrible second Charlotte thought she saw panic. But then he took a deep breath, crossed to her and knelt beside her chair. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "A little," Charlotte admitted, "but mostly hopeful, excited, ready." "I'm terrified," Alexander confessed, his honesty hard-won. "But Charlotte, I refuse to let fear rule us anymore. We face this together, with hope, with joy, with every medical precaution available, yes, but fundamentally with trust that we can build the future we want." Charlotte cupped his face in her hands. "No more what-ifs, Alexander. Just what is. And what is that we're going to have a baby and we're going to be wonderful parents, and we're going to fill this house with love." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Alexander was comically overprotective, hiring 3 doctors and insisting Charlotte rest constantly until she laughingly threatened to ban him from her presence if he didn't relax. 9 months later, on a spring morning full of birdsong and sunlight, Charlotte gave birth to a healthy daughter. Alexander insisted on being present throughout the labor, scandalizing the midwife and doctors, but refusing to leave Charlotte's side. "I'm not missing a moment of our life together," he declared. "Not anymore." When the baby was placed in Charlotte's arms, both parents wept with joy. She was perfect, tiny and pink and wailing with impressive lung capacity. "Hope," Charlotte said immediately. "Her name is Hope. Hope Rosalind Hartley," Alexander added softly, looking to Charlotte for approval. Charlotte smiled through her tears. "Perfect. Honoring the past while embracing the future." Yes, the christening 3 months later was attended by half of London society, but the moment Charlotte treasured most came afterwards, when they were alone in the nursery. Alexander held baby Hope with a confidence that still surprised him, swaying gently as she dozed against his chest. Charlotte stood at the window watching rain fall, so similar to that terrible wedding night, yet completely different. Alexander came to stand beside her, Hope sleeping peacefully in his arms, and wrapped his free arm around Charlotte's waist. "Do you ever regret forgiving me?" he asked quietly. "Every day," Charlotte teased, then saw his stricken expression and relented. "Never, but I'm glad you had to work for it. I'm glad we built this foundation on truth and effort, rather than convenience or obligation. I'd search 1,000 times over," Alexander said seriously. "I'd cross the world on my knees to find you again." Hope stirred and whimpered, and Charlotte took her, settling into the rocking chair to nurse. Alexander sat beside them, his hand resting on Charlotte's shoulder, and for a long moment they simply existed together. No ghosts, no fear, no walls. Just a family, hard-won and deeply cherished. "Come," Charlotte said eventually, smiling at her husband with eyes full of love and promise. "Our life is waiting." And it was, full of challenges certainly, of sleepless nights and society's demands and all the complications that come with being human. But they faced it together. These two people who'd learned that real love isn't perfection. It's the courage to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to change and grow and choose each other every single day. Sometimes second chances are possible. Sometimes earned forgiveness is the most beautiful gift of all. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, love finds you twice. First as a spark that terrifies you, then as a flame you've learned to tend with care, honesty, and unwavering commitment to seeing and being seen by another human soul. My friends, sometimes love requires courage, not just to open your heart, but to admit when you've been wrong. Alexander searched across England, not just for Charlotte, but for the man brave enough to be vulnerable, to change, to love again, despite his fears. Perhaps you know this journey. The walls we build that become prisons the moment you realize safety without love is just existence. Tonight, remember, it's never too late to search for what you've lost. It's never too late to whisper, "Forgive me." And real love isn't perfection. It's the courage to be imperfectly, honestly human together. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Vintage Romance Secrets and hit that bell so you never miss another tale of love lost and found again. Share this with someone who believes in second chances. Tell me in the comments, have you ever searched for a second chance at love? Sweet dreams, dear romantics.